Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for volunteering to be here this morning for this mandatory meeting. I very much appreciate it. Well, since the one person I didn't know we've met, so I'm just really introduced. But I'm Jeff Barnett, Rachel Lawson. Our goal is to talk a little bit about being a teaching assistant, graduate assistant, research assistant, those various roles, and it's really just the idea of an orientation session to make sure everyone has the same body of knowledge going into it. Even if you've already been a TA more than once, it's still, I think, good to review what are some of the key challenges, issues, concerns, pitfalls, and then in addition to, and we're trained in CPR, so don't worry. But in addition, I want to try it out. Yeah, we'll work it out. So in addition to information we want to share with you, we've built time in really to have discussion and for each of you to share some of your past experiences, concerns, lessons learned, things like that as well. So in terms of, these are some of the things we'll be talking about, just to kind of go through, I'm not going to read it all right now, but these are the kind of basic issues. We really want to make sure everyone has the same body of knowledge. And to really know what your role is, and to, in terms of informed consent, we're really talking between you and the faculty member you're working with, to know what is your role, and what are the parameters of your responsibilities, what are the expectations of you. And some of this is to protect you, to make sure you're not taken advantage of, so you know what you're getting into. And some of it also has to do with issues of power and authority that we'll be talking about a little bit later, just in terms of, what are your responsibilities, what are your duties, and what are you allowed to do or authorized to do, what's appropriate for your role. And obviously, in terms of competence and scope of your duties, that's very relevant to what we're just mentioning. And the idea of, well, what are the competencies you need to have to be a TA, to be good in this role? And again, when I say TA, I mean graduate assistant, research assistant, any of these roles. But there are certain competencies that really are essential to have. And hopefully it's better to know these in advance rather than do sort of the on-the-job training and discover it as you go along. Because if you've tried that before, you know that it doesn't work quite as well. And then Rachel will be talking about the confidentiality issue, and again, some of the special features of the role that you'll be in, of having access to student information. Some of it about grades and performance in the class, and some very personal and private matters in a student's life that maybe are affecting their performance and they have to discuss with you. And again, how you manage that will be really important. And I mentioned the issue of the limits to your authority, dealing with student problems and concerns that come up. We all hope that we'll only have really motivated, hardworking students who all do a great job and turn in everything on time. But as you might imagine, that doesn't always happen. And so how you manage those. And then there'll be a big focus on just how you handle and manage, how you actually kind of negotiate or navigate the different relationships. Things like you're someone's TA, yet they're your classmate in another course. And maybe in that other course, you're working together and you're a teammate on a project. And so in one position, you have authority over them and a very different role. And then the other one, your peers. Or how do you manage a social life with people that you're the TA for? And so we'll be talking about those. And depending on whether it's an undergraduate student or a graduate student, the dynamics obviously can change somewhat as well. And then Rachel will be talking about, from her experience, having TA'd 6 different times already in her very limited time at Loyola, packing them in. Some of the things you've learned as you've gone through this.
All right, so first we're going to talk about informed consent. And I know you guys hear a lot about informed consent with regard to clinical matters, but it also applies here. So there are a lot of different ways that you can become a TA for a class, which I'm sure many of you already know. So sometimes someone will approach you and ask you to become a teaching assistant, and you have to make a decision about whether you want to accept it. Other times there'll be an email sent out. You might, it might spike your interest teaching that class or getting involved in that project, and so you might think about that. Or other times you might really be interested in a particular subject and might seek it out yourself. So you might reach out to a professor. And there are a lot of benefits to becoming a teaching assistant, graduate assistant, so why would you do that? So with regard to teaching specifically, can be really, really great experience if you want to go on and teach in the future. And you get a lot of feedback from a supervisor, meaning the faculty member that's working with you. And that way, when you go on and become your own teacher, don't necessarily have someone watching over you, you have all this experience already under your belt, and you kind of know the ropes a little bit. It also gives you great experience in public speaking, and you can sit there and sort of develop your competency as someone who is able to communicate clearly and speak to others and feel comfortable doing that. You can also share your knowledge, which is something that I found to be particularly rewarding, is feeling like you're an expert in a particular subject area, and sharing that with others can be really beneficial. And then you get to develop a relationship with all the different students and faculty members, which is also very rewarding. And then lastly, something which we all is very salient in our minds is that it looks pretty good on your CV to get involved and sort of get into these roles. So those are some reasons why you might want to accept the position. However, you want to get informed about what the position entails before you make a decision. And this is something that I think falls by the wayside. I think that a lot of times we don't always really think through all these things before we say, yes, I would love to TA for you. So oftentimes it's sort of a split-second decision. But you want to think about the time commitment that it's going to involve, and that can include a lot of different things. So not only how much time do you have to spend in class, but how much time are you spending meeting with students outside of class? Are you holding review sessions outside on the weekends? Are you expected to respond to emails regularly and late? Are you supposed to be on call sort of by phone? You know, what does that entail as far as the time commitment goes? And then as far as the teaching requirements, are you required to teach a lab? Or are you just sort of sitting in on the professor's class and then you handle some of the grading? So if you're required to teach a lab, you want to know, well, do I have to develop my own PowerPoints, or is the material going to be given to me? Do I have to come up with an agenda for what I'm going to do? So those are some things that you would want to think about before you take on this position. And then for grading, you have to consider whether you're going to be required to develop the rubrics for the grading assignments, or are they already sort of laid out for you. And sometimes, like for instance, I've had classes where there really was no rubric, and I was sort of independently allowed to grade it or give comments, and so sometimes there's no structure. And do you feel comfortable with that? Do you feel like you're sort of able to look at something critically and evaluate it? And that's something we'll talk about a little more, I think, in the next slide. And then you want to know how much compensation you're going to get for the position, and that varies depending on the position. Sometimes it's no pay at all, and you're just doing it for the experience. But overall, you want to make sure that you ask questions and you become a partner with the faculty member, and it's the faculty member's job to let you know all this information, but sometimes they're busy, they might not think to really sit down and talk about all this information with you ahead of time, so it's your job to ask questions and get informed yourself. And then lastly, once you sort of evaluate all of those factors, you want to consider whether you're actually able to take on the commitment and whether that's a reasonable thing to do given the amount of classes you have, the clinical demand that you have, or you know, what else you're involved in, what other activities you do. Is it reasonable for you to get involved in something that requires X amount of time? And if you do get involved in something that you might not have as much time for, you're risking burnout, and you're also risking a poor experience for the students that you're working with, and when you're not giving your full effort or your full ability or cognitive ability, if you're tired or overworked or something, they're the ones who oftentimes suffer.
So if you're here today, obviously you've already made the commitment, and you said, yes, I'll do this. But that doesn't mean that all these issues have been clarified yet. And you know, sort of as an informed consumer, you need to sit down with the faculty member and make sure you have a good, clear understanding on those expectations. And you know, will I be doing grading? And is there a rubric? And how is that done? And, you know, how many hours? And do I do a lab? And do I need PowerPoints? You know, all the things you mentioned, that gets negotiated. And it's not that it's set in stone. I mean, you can discuss it and decide what you're comfortable with and what you need support for or help with, things like that. Those of you who've TA'd before, you know, you've kind of learned as you've gone along and you have a good sense of it. But if it's the first time, it really is good to have this discussion up front and sure you know what you're getting into. I'm guessing you can remember when you were originally asked, would you like to be a TA for Psychodiagnostics 1? And my method for picking TAs was basically someone who took the class with me, received an A, did great, has an outgoing personality, is a hard worker, who I think would be a good TA. And then I talk to that student and say, are you interested in doing this? I'd love to have you be my TA next semester. And here are the potential pluses and minuses, because I think both exist. And from my perspective, one of the big pluses is you are going to be really expert at this after being a TA. So if it's psychodiagnostics or techniques of psychotherapy or whatever the area is, you're going to get so much experience. It's going to really elevate your competence in that domain. Potential drawback might be the amount of time involved and the tediousness of grading all these records and papers and stuff like that. So there's some aspects are less exciting than others. But again, that experience is really valuable. And in addition to going on your CV, which Rachel mentioned, it's also an opportunity to work more closely with a faculty member. When you're going to get letters of recommendation, you want them to be from faculty who really know you well, know you personally, and have worked with you in multiple forms or settings. Not just, I took a class with this person and what can they say? Oh, you got an A or A minus. And so to work with the faculty member in this other capacity really makes a difference too. So it's just things to consider. I mentioned very briefly before about the idea of competence, and just like with any kind of teaching, there's competence in the content, and then competence in the actual ability to convey the information. And so if you do run a lab, you're teaching, and you actually you're the person. Here's my understanding from having taught and had TAs. Students go to the TAs. They don't go to the faculty member. That it seems like, they're easier to talk to, or you could admit it, right?
No, please finish.
Okay. But anyway, I'm sure you all understand that. So the students are going to come to you, and if they don't understand something from class, you're the person who's going to be explaining it. And so really making sure you feel confident in the subject matter where you're going to be a TA. And just because a faculty member asks you, doesn't mean you have to do it. You have to be comfortable. And I mentioned how, I ask students who had in my class, but what if it's a new faculty member that was just hired and you're going to be that person's TA? So you haven't had experience with that person. You don't know what their style is. You're not sure what it would be like working with them. And that's where that whole discussion and informed consent process becomes even more important.
I think that a lot of times when there is an email sent out or somebody sort of asks you to come on as a teaching assistant, if it's a class that maybe you don't know a whole lot about, but it's something that you might want to learn more about and develop your skills in, you might be tempted to say yes in order to sort of beef up your own abilities. Like for instance, in research methods or something. When I took on that class, I really wanted to strengthen my research skills. But you want to sort of gauge where your knowledge base is before you agree to take on something like that. So if you're going to have to do all this legwork on the front end to be able to get yourself up to par, maybe that's fine. Maybe you're able to do that. However, what kind of burden are you placing on yourself to get up to the level where you're competent to teach it to others? And so that's a decision that you want to make, considering your own abilities. And sometimes that professor may have had you in class and may know their own class that they're teaching and say, hey, I had you in this class, I know what your knowledge base is, I think it'll be fine for this particular course or something. And that's great, but you want to have that type of conversation. And I know that in my experience, being a TA or being a GA or whatever, that you want to feel like you are competent, you want to feel confident, you want to go in there knowing what you're talking about, because number one, it's awkward for you if you don't know, answers to questions, and I'm not talking about an answer that you might not reasonably know, and that's okay, you want to say that you don't know that and then go find it out, but if you're constantly unable to answer the questions and are sort of having to go back and look up everything yourself, that doesn't really look that great to the students, and it might create a really poor experience for the students. Well, my TA doesn't even know this stuff, and how am I supposed to know it, or how am I supposed to ask questions and get those questions answered? And then the burden falls on the faculty member to sort of fill you in if you're running to the faculty member and asking the questions. So you just want to make sure that it's a good fit for your skills and in that respect. And I think that it's important to make sure that the students are having a really good experience with you as a TA as well. I know that a lot of students, especially the undergrads who are maybe declared psychology as their major or haven't declared a major yet, their experience with you in a psych class, maybe an intro psych or intro research methods or something, might be their only experience, and it could make or break their decision to sort of go on to explore this cool world of psychology or sort of ditch it and hit the economics or something like that. So I think that confidence as a teacher, being able to teach and feeling confident in what you're able to give them is really important, not only for you and your comfort in that role, but also for them on the receiving end and how they perceive you and how they feel like secure in the class. And
right, think of what are those things, attributes, faculty that you've experienced that really helped you to enjoy a class and find it exciting and interesting, you know, in terms of enthusiasm or making a connection with them, or they really seem to care about your learning, or they took extra time to help you understand things. You know, what are those things you would want to emulate, to keep those in mind and to use those to kind of model how you want to be in this role? Because I agree, this could be something, an experience that helps someone decide this is the career and the field for me, or I think I'll go elsewhere. And so it is an important role.
And part of that, I think, is having a conversation with the professor about their preferred style and how they conduct the class. And I think this is really different depending on the nature of the course. Like, for instance, a psychodiagnostics course where you're writing reports, every professor has a different standard for the type of report or the nature of the report that they want produced. And so you want to make sure that you're on the same page with what they're expecting from you and what kind of standards that you should be holding the students accountable to. So you could ask for a work sample ahead of time so that you get a sense of what they want from you. Thanks, Serena. And then you can give them something or maybe grade something, and you can grade something and then give it to the professor and ask them for feedback, and it's going to vary whether or not the professor is actually going to look over what you may have graded. Like, some professors won't even look at what you graded and handed back to students, and others will look at it very closely, so that's going to vary. And you want to make sure that you feel comfortable with what you're giving back to the students, and so that's one way to do that, is to ask the professor to sort of look at what you've given them and get feedback on that. And then you want to consider your own style in matching with a particular professor. So if you're someone who tends to grade harshly, for instance, I know that I've gotten that feedback before, that you should,
the nice TA and the mean TA.
I was in the TA for a little while, it changes. But sometimes you want to check in with the professor and see if you really are grading too hardly or something. So you want to make sure that you consider your own style, and if you're a really shy person, for instance, and you want to allow your skills to blossom, then maybe you'd want to teach a class where you get to teach aloud. Or maybe you really don't want to do that, and maybe you can just select a class where you're just grading in the background, or you're doing some research coding in the background instead of interacting with people or something. So you want to consider your own style when finding the right match for you and having a conversation with the professor about it.
Right, and Rachel's point about what are your goals in being in this position or this role are really important, because you can push yourself. You can talk to the faculty member and say, can I have the opportunity to do this, or can I do 2 lectures to the class during the semester? Can we work together for that? Or what are other opportunities? Not just grading. So it's an opportunity for you to grow and develop skills as well. And if you're thinking you might like to be a teacher in the future, what a great opportunity, to have mentorship and actually prepare a lesson, give a lecture, run the class one day, get feedback from the faculty member who's there at the same time. That's a lot better than just sort of doing it on your own, as you say, no feedback, no input. So, a lot of the role gets negotiated. It's up to you. What are your goals? What would you like to do?
Yeah, and so I think that throughout a lot of this presentation, we talk about like being your own advocate, and that's really what you have to do. Is you really have to, even in the coming semester, if you guys are, you know, teaching or involved in some project in the coming semester, be your own advocate and seek out what experiences you want and see if that's something that you guys can negotiate.
So I'll mention a little bit about confidentiality. You know, there's a federal law, FERPA, which, you know, you don't have to read the law and know all the details, but basically any student who's 18 years or older is an adult, and they control their own privacy of their educational records. So for example, if a parent calls me with concern and says, you know, I heard my son struggling, what did he get on the last paper? And, you know, I'm not, it's just like if you're a psychotherapist and someone, a family member calls you and you haven't previously received authorization to speak to them, you can't share the information. And we will regularly receive information or have access to information that needs to be treated with confidentiality. There are times when a student might be struggling, or you might be aware of it, you might notice it. The student might not come up to you, but you notice that the student, you know, seems like they're not doing well, and, or just seeming, you know, disheveled and not paying attention, and they're struggling in class maybe, and you want to speak with them, and they're going to talk to you about personal and private matters. It doesn't mean you're taking on the counselor or clinician role, but just in your role as a teaching assistant to speak with them about that. If anything that affects their performance in the class or their functioning in the program is of relevance. And you know, if it's a student who's also doing an externship, so they're seeing clients, I think it's really relevant if you think a student might be depressed. You notice it in class, and you don't just say, oh, this is just an academic class, you know. I'm sure their supervisor will talk to them. So you have this obligation and responsibility to be monitoring more than just academic functioning. It's also professionalism and emotional, interpersonal functioning, and, you know, attending to that. And when speaking to students, you know, it's confidential, not meaning you can't discuss it with a faculty member, but just not outside of the three of you. And so if I met with a student in my office and we talked about personal issues, and then the next class, you know, maybe during the break, as a student's walking up the aisle to go to, you know, leave the room during the break, I say, so how are things going with your situation? Yeah, that's inappropriate. I need to wait until we're in my office or there's no one else around. So anything that's a personal issue is really relevant, but you know, the AK Ethics Code, it actually mandates that faculty, and you're in the faculty role, have not only the right but the obligation to ask about any kinds of personal issues that appear to be affecting the student's functioning. And it's not just academic performance, it's emotional as well. And that students have an obligation, they must disclose that. And if they're not comfortable talking to you, then you refer them to the instructor. You know, and that's a little bit different than just how you treat the confidentiality of grades. And you know, do you post students' grades? Do you share them with others? You discuss grades in class? You know, many students view their grades as a very private matter, and they don't want it discussed or posted. And so, and typically, you know, it's something that, you know, like for example, if you just have like a bunch of papers that were graded and leave them in a box on a counter in the department, and students just go and pick theirs, that's really not protecting privacy then. You know, I suppose in theory, if you just have ID numbers but not names, that might be better. But there has to be a better way of managing information that we consider to be confidential.
I think just with regard to the comment about you approaching a student about an issue that you may have talked about in the past or something, I think that a lot of times we get the experience of students coming to us that tell us about something, maybe why they missed class or why, you know, something that's going on, and a lot of times we don't give them the opportunity to talk in private because we're in a classroom full of other students. So when the reverse happens, when they approach you, maybe that it's okay to sort of stop and say, hey, let's go outside for a second and to finish this conversation. So if you notice that it's a sensitive material or a sensitive conversation, take the initiative to bring them outside and give them the opportunity to have that privacy, because sometimes it can be hard to, not only is it inappropriate to confront them in the public of all the class, but it's also sort of our responsibility to take them outside and give them the opportunity to talk in private if they want to. And then with regard to the confidentiality of grades, I know that I have a roommate who's in the master's program, and so when I bring home materials that I'm going to grade, it's even more important, even if I had someone that was not in our program, but it's now even more serious, that I need to make sure that those grades are put away in my room, on my desk, and that we maybe have a conversation about, you know, hey, I'm grading this stuff, you're really not supposed to be looking at it, so don't go on my desk, or something like that if you need something, you know? But I know a lot of you guys have roommates or, you know, significant others that you live with, and so when you have that type of material, that's something that you need to think about, not leaving that stuff on the counter, because it is your responsibility to keep that private as well, not leaving it in your car, or, you know, who knows where.
Treat it like client information.
Yeah.
That's the way I think about it.
Yeah. And then another thing that I wanted to mention is the idea of gossip. So it can be really tempting, especially when we're in a really close program, for instance, or you know people, to sort of talk about somebody who's in one of your classes, or, you know, somebody else knows somebody and you're like, oh, well, such and such did really well in my class, or such and such actually got the worst grade in the class and is really struggling. All of those things are really inappropriate for us to engage in with others, and sometimes it's tempting because we do know a lot of people, and things like that come up in conversation, and so you just want to be really careful, because it is you're being entrusted with their information as well.
Yeah, when we talk more about sort of the boundary, local relationship issue, you can see how it's just so easy for this to just naturally happen. You know, you come home from school and you're kind of stressed out and frustrated, and your roommate says, oh, what's wrong? And you say, oh, this one student's really, you know, whatever. And it's like, oh, who? And it's like, you really can't vent to your roommate or others about things that are confidential. You know, so it's just something you have to really take some care to protect.
Yeah, and just keep in mind that this information is really class dependent as well. So it's all confidential, all the grades, all that material, but it's especially more sensitive when it's a class, like for instance, like a supervision class or like a therapy class where people are actually sharing that information. Don't leave their DVD of like a mock therapy session in the DVD player, for instance, if you had to watch that. I know that's something I had to try to remind myself not to do. And keep in mind that this also applies to the participants, like if you're, you know, doing research or something. This involves the participants of the research in addition to the students that you might be teaching or anybody that you might be supervising as well. So it's everybody that's involved.
So we talked a little bit about authority and power, and this idea of what is your role, what are your responsibilities, but also what are you authorized to do? And, you know, do you actually do grading, or you do scoring and correcting and feedback, but the faculty member does the actual grading? Or are you allowed to make course decisions if a student says, you know, is it okay if I hand this in next week instead? Do you have the authority to make that decision? And actually, I know you want to talk a little bit about the difference between authority and power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so authority is just, you know, sort of who sort of has the right to make the decision about something and what the limits of your decision making are. Whereas power, I think that coming into one of these roles, it's about unequal level, or sort of a hierarchy. And so when you come into this role as a teaching assistant, graduate assistant, whatever, you are oftentimes for the first time in a position of power over other students. And some of those students might be your friends, some of them might be people that you know, or maybe you don't know them at all, people that you don't like, you know? So you're in that position of having some kind of hierarchical power over them, and so you want to make sure that you're checking that and you're controlling that. And I know that nobody here is maliciously, you know, trying to give people poor grades or sabotage anything, but you also don't want to give preferential treatment to your friends or somebody that you know really well or something. So you want to just make sure that you're being as unbiased as possible when you're grading or when you're engaging with students and interacting. And this also refers to the people around the student. So for instance, if you are teaching a class, a teaching assistant, and one of the students in your class is one of your friends or someone who you're really friendly with, you want to make sure that everyone else feels like that student is at the same level as them. So if you're giving that student preferential treatment or even just talking with them more or I mean, there are a lot of different ways that you can sort of send a message to people in the rest of the class, and so you want to make sure that not only are you maintaining that professional relationship with your friend, but you're also giving the impression to everybody else that, hey, even though I know this person, we're all sort of on the same page.
And so treating people equally and fairly, trying to be as objective as possible. That certainly gets back to grading, and you might even be in a situation where you have to decide, is it appropriate for me to grade this particular person's papers, and maybe I can do all the others, but the professor should do that person's. And that's a very reasonable decision to make. If you're not sure, it's always best to ask. It's not just, is there a conflict of interest, it's more, is there the potential appearance to others of a conflict of interest? And if it's reasonable that others would view it, then you have to take some actions to avoid it.
Yeah, and it can be difficult when you're in a class and you see the same person over the course of the semester, and you get to know how that person does their work, and maybe that influences when you see that person's assignment come in the next round. That might influence how you look at their work, for instance, and in either direction. It might be looked at, oh, the student's going to have like a great piece of work, or they're actually, I'm going to spend a lot more time on this, for instance. So I think a really nice way that I've known that some professors have done this is they've done ID numbers to identify, so that you don't really know whose it is when you get it, and that's really nice. But you want to really try to be objective whenever you're grading, and if I have like a full stack of midterms or something, I'll grade all of the same problem, but even by the time I get to the last person, I've noticed that my grading has changed from the first person because I've seen all these responses. So you want to make sure that you sort of double back, and I probably spend a lot more time doing that than I should, but it's just something that I do to make sure that I'm sort of keeping myself in check and the grading.
If you're grading 40 papers, to you it's 40 papers, but to each individual, when they get their paper back, that's their grade.
Okay.
And they're hoping you really did read the whole thing and do it carefully, and do it objectively and fairly, and give the helpful feedback. It's not just check marks and X's and -2s and things like that, but actual verbal feedback. So if the student gets points off, they'll know why. That there's a feedback loop of learning that should be taking place. Just the grade alone isn't really helping them. But so the valuable feedback that you can give them, and if you do then see a pattern of a student who's not doing well, or like you're given the same feedback 3 times, you can say, well, they just need to work harder, or that's their issue, or maybe you contact that student and say, why don't we meet and let's go over this, and how invested are you in each student's success? That will come through as well.
So these are some common issues and problems that might come up in your dealing with students. So sometimes they might be unhappy with their grades, for instance. They might be particularly struggling, and as Dr. Burnett mentioned before, they might have some personal issues that come to light. And so, I mean, the thing to do to handle these when students are unhappy with their grades, for instance, is really to be objective and, take the rubric, compare their answers to the rubric. And it can be really hard not to get defensive because you gave them the grade, and so you really want to try not to be defensive, to stay calm, to express your understanding that they're frustrated about the grade that they got, and realize that it is their grade, and they have the right to question you and sort of figure out what was going on. And so, of course, you want to bring it to the professor, because the professor has the last word about the grades. So that can be a difficult situation to handle, but it's really common actually. And then a lot of times you'll run into struggling students, or students that you've noticed are maybe not doing as well, not grasping the material as well. That can be really uncomfortable to sort of approach a student like that and have a conversation with them. But it's better to be proactive about that and let the professor know, and reach out to the student and let them know that you're available for help. And then with regard to personal issues, I know that Dr. Burnett talked a lot about that, but sometimes personal issues are just personal issues and they don't necessarily affect the schoolwork. So you can just give some resources, or you can, if you see that something's going on, you can sort of reach out and see what you can do to help. But if it is affecting the work, then you definitely want to step in and get involved and contact the professor and have a conversation so that you can all sort of come to a decision. I know that you can probably speak more to that.
Yeah, I think you covered it nicely, but I think that the basic issue is, everyone has struggles. Everyone has a personal life. Everyone has things they're juggling and managing and all that. And if, you know, the goal is not to be each student's pal or friend and, you know, hang out with them and things like that. That creates its own set of challenges. But for it to be accessible and to seem to care, to seem interested to them, so that they will speak to you if they have an issue that, you know, needs to be addressed. Hopefully they'll see you as a resource instead of the goal.
These are psychology skills, right?
Yeah, that'd be a good way to put it. Knowing that you all have those skills,
Not quite,
that'd be
but-
great. Like,
With the limits, not like therapy, but, you know, use your empathy and reach out and look.
right, and as you say, and then offer resources, and then if it is affecting them academically, or if you think it might be affecting them in a clinical setting, you know, I agree, get the instructor involved. And, you know, we've had situations where sometimes students do need personal psychotherapy, and that will help them to be successful in the program. And other times where a student needs a leave of absence, or, you know, take one less class, or cut back on their outside work, or just have emotional support for what they're going through in their personal life. And again, I agree, not take on the psychotherapist role, but more or less be a sounding board, be a resource, and then a conduit to other resources, whether it's the instructor, counseling center, you know, the writing center. I mean, there'd be lots of resources that might be valuable and helpful to students. So.
This is a big one. I think that we'll spend quite a bit of time on this, and we want to hear your input on this as well. But this is mainly about navigating the roles and relationships that you have. So with regard to a role, you can serve in multiple roles in your faculty member that might be the teacher for the class that you're, or the supervisor of your research project or something. That means basically that they're serving in multiple capacities to you. So they might be your supervisor for, you know, this class that you're teaching. They might be your instructor in another class. Well, at the same time, they might be your clinical supervisor. So there's a lot of different hats that they might wear, so to speak. Whereas relationships are with the same person, and you're sort of interacting with them in a different way. It's the nature of the relation with them. So there are different types of relationships that you can get in. So there's sexual relationships and non-sexual. And we're primarily going to talk about the non-sexual relationships. Sexual relationships, never good in this realm of what we're talking about.
That appearance of a conflict of interest might be relevant
Yes.
in that situation.
And we're going to talk about, you know, situations that are avoidable versus maybe necessary and unavoidable. And so sexual relationships, always avoidable, avoid them. But some of these different types of relationships might actually be very plausible to happen. Like for instance, if you were a student's therapist, you're the mock therapist in their relationship they had for PPP, they were in. Let me back up. So you were the supervisor for someone conducting therapy. Okay, so sorry. And then you became their TA the next semester. So that's what happened to me. So I was, for instance, a supervisor for this student, and then they showed up in one of the classes that I was going to be TAing. So I had to sort of figure out how to navigate that situation. And the main thing that you want to keep in mind is whether or not the relationship that you're engaging in, or the multiple relationships, involve exploitation or bias your objectivity in some way.
Well, I'll give you another example. So when we are assigning supervisors, so Dr. Yu and I look at who are the students who are taking principles and practices of psychotherapy, who are the student supervisors, and then we look at it and say, are there any pre-existing relationships we know of that we need to be concerned about? It's like, oh, these two people are dating. Okay, well, I don't think this one should supervise that one. We'll have so-and-so be that person's supervisor. And it's just a premeditated, thoughtful decision about, are there any pre-existing relationships that would just make it inappropriate, because you can't be neutral and objective and unbiased.
Right.
And how do you give feedback to someone that's negative, perhaps, from their perspective when you're in that kind of relationship? Maybe you would hold back and not give the same feedback. Or maybe you'd be overly positive. But the idea is then the training or the learning experience is different, and maybe it's not as beneficial. Maybe they need that feedback.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of really common, this happens a lot, I'm sure you guys all have like one instance where something like that has happened. But for instance, my roommate, like I said, is in the master's program, and I was going to be teaching a class last semester, and she was supposed to be taking the class. So I had to talk to her ahead of time and be like, hey, don't sign up for this block, because this is the one that I'm teaching, for instance, because I didn't want to engage in that. That would have been inappropriate if we had an argument or a disagreement, or maybe we were best buds. It just really wouldn't have been good for the nature of the course, for instance. Or, you know, you might be a teaching assistant for one class or a research assistant, be involved with somebody, and then you end up on a sports team, an intramural softball team, for instance, or basketball, and your adrenaline's running high, and, you know, you're getting ticked off. You know, it's just not a really great situation.
You know, it's happened to all of you.
Yeah. I think they all know I'm talking about.
Oh, I thought this was a hypothetical. I have another hypothetical.
Okay, let's hear it.
Paige.
That doesn't sound hypothetical to me.
Purely hypothetical. So Paige, in your role as a graduate assistant working with me this past semester, you were in the role of grading papers of your classmates. And we had to do something about that so it can be done appropriately, right? What did we do? Right, so all students submitted things to me electronically. I then would delete their name, put an ID number, then I kept a sheet, a list with names and ID numbers that only I had, and then I forwarded them to you, so you only had ID numbers. And then did you just grade them based upon your own intrinsic knowledge of the topic, or how did you do that?
No, I had a rubric.
Right, so again, there was some latitude, but again, for each item there was a rubric, and we went over that, and you know, that's, I think, an example of perhaps how it works, right? But for you to grade your classmates and friends' papers, knowing whose they are, would seem quite inappropriate. And you might say, no, I can be objective. Like, I put my hand up and close one eye and graded them without knowing who it was. You know, it's like, it's just better to avoid the problem. It's not to suggest you couldn't handle it, but it needs the appearance to others also. So that was hypothetical.
Very.
Okay, good.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I think that we want to hear more about what you guys have at the end, about if you've experienced any of these and any advice that you've had to navigate. But I think that, you know, when you come to realize that one of these situations occurs, the best thing is to sort of, like we said, evaluate whether or not you think that you'll be biased, or whether there are steps that you can take to eliminate the bias, like the ID numbers, or, you know, switching to a different section, for instance, something like that. And then if it happens that you encounter the person again, then you want to have a conversation at the beginning of when you notice that they've sort of come into your life again. And we'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. We talk about prevention as well, some tips.
And one point I overlooked with Paige, because I know you'd like to be in the spotlight more. So, did you actually grade these papers? You assign grades?
No.
Or what did you do?
I, made corrections, added comments, and I sent it back to.
Right, and that's that authority and responsibility issue we talked about. So you had a rubric, you tracked changes in comment boxes, had all sorts of comments and corrections, and then I reviewed all that, and then I decided what the grade would be, as opposed to saying, go ahead, just grade them and send them out. You know, that'd be quite different. Because again, really the faculty member has the ultimate responsibility for the grade and needs to ensure certain oversight, ensure we're not delegating tasks that are inappropriate also. So, but you all, not everyone takes classes together in the same sequence. So you could be a TA in one semester for someone, and then in the next semester they're your classmate and you're on a team together doing a project. And there's going to be even just social life. It's a small graduate program. You're a TA, but then it's, you were saying recently, Society Olympics, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's another situation where...
I've been told there's alcohol involved.
There is, and it's very well known that there is alcohol involved there. And, everybody attends, everybody in the program, and if you're a doctoral student teaching assistant or graduate assistant, you deal with these people, you have to sort of check yourself, and you have to know that if you're going to engage in any kind of professional evaluative role over these people, that you might want to proactively not get wasted at Society Olympics so that you don't, create that impression, and how do they then look up to you later on, and this person's assigning me grades and I saw them, I don't want to go to the extreme, but I saw them stumbling and, you know, having trouble. So you want to sort of proactively think about those types of things before you engage in a social event or some kind of situation that's going to compromise your authority and the respect that the students might have for you, and just how comfortable you might feel later on down the road having a professional relationship.
I was going to say, it's a professionalism issue.
Yeah.
Because just imagine if you're a psychologist and you're living and working in a community, how do you want to portray yourself in the community to people who may become your clients or who might be potential referral sources? I mean, it's not to say you can't have a private life and can't do fun things, but there is a certain element of you're always a psychologist and people view you that way. So if you're a TA, you know, you're in a social setting, you're still a TA and, you know, you're still being professional even when you're having fun.
Yeah, so here's just some recommendations about this. So the first step that we said is ask yourself, is it really necessary to engage in this multiple relationship? You know, was it really necessary for me to TA the particular section that my roommate was in? No. Was it necessary for her to take that section? No. So we made arrangements so that that wouldn't happen. And what you want to really think about, what's going to be the result if I do engage in this, and is there going to be any exploitation? Can we take some steps to prevent that? And recognize that you're in the position of power, and keep yourself checked with regard to the power that you have, and really go above and beyond to maintain a professional relationship of power and, you know, authority over those people. Compartmentalize, I think, is really important. So within your interactions, you want to make sure that you're being professional in your teaching role, but then when you want to engage with that person that you're friends with, for instance, you can sort of separate those two roles. So for instance, I keep using this as an example, but my roommate, you know, having this class, she was in this class and I was a teaching assistant for this class, and she knew that. And so a lot of times it was really easy if she had a question about the material to ask me, because I was right there. And so I had to sort of say, hey, you know, why don't you ask your own TA about that? And so you want to really make sure that you separate and set the boundaries for where your role sort of ends and your friendship role, or your whatever social role, relationship, I keep saying role, but where that ends. And so it's really your responsibility to set those boundaries.
You know, with the roommate situation,
Yeah.
since it's different sections, you're answering based upon what you and your faculty member do.
Yeah,
And the other faculty member might do it differently.
right.
And so it's easy enough to explain, you know, it's really best for you to talk to your
Yeah.
TA for this reason.
Yeah, well, that's how I explained it, but all, you know, my motives were different. I didn't want to, you know, answer those questions when I was at home, because that was, it was different, you know, different settings. And then I think it's important to understand where your loyalties and your responsibilities must lie, and that's with the students that you're sort of responsible for their learning. So whatever's in their best interest is really what should be in your best interest as a teaching assistant. And then consulting with the professor. I know it's really easy to consult with your fellow classmates when you encounter some of these multiple relationships, because it's a lot easier, but it's good to consult with a particular faculty member who might be instructing that course. And then knowing yourself and sort of knowing you know, what your limits are and at what point you might become not objective or subjective, and really being able to recognize that and admit that, you know, you can't really handle it, or it's not something that you can do without any kind of bias.
And also, like, let's say you're going through a really busy time in your schedule because, you know, you have 5 things due in 1 week, and there's also a lot happening for the students in the class you're a TA for. You know, you can look at your schedule in advance, talk to the faculty member, and say, you know, is it possible for me to give this back on this day instead, or can I have an extra weekend for grading that? And can we adjust this on the syllabus? And, you know, again, that's a form of consultation also, I think.
Yeah. And then, you know, when you figure out that something's happened where you're engaged in a multiple relationship, or you figure out that you're a teammate with somebody who you're teaching, you know, contact somebody, talk to somebody, figure out what the best course of action is. And then try to prevent these situations is mostly the message that we're trying to get across. So try to see them ahead of time, anticipate them ahead of time, because it's a lot easier to do that rather than, correct the damage once it's already sort of been done.
Yeah, and really just being very honest. If you don't know something, you don't know it, and it's okay to say, wow, that's a great question. I'm really not sure. Let me check with Dr. So-and-so, and I'll email you back by tomorrow. And it doesn't make you look bad if you don't know something. It makes you look bad if you give bad information. So I think that's okay too.
Yeah, and the next slide is just a little bit more about, prevention. So these incidental contacts, outside the Olympics or, on a team with somebody, sometimes they can't really be anticipated or planned out, and sometimes it just might happen. And so it's best to just figure out or think about how you might handle that situation, particularly if you're involved with a sensitive topic ahead of time. So if you're, a supervisor in class and you anticipate that you might run into your person that you're supervising, then you might want to think about how you might handle that. Maybe you just, smile at them and wait and see if they want to say hello to you. It's sort of like that therapy thing. If you run into your client outside, how do you expect to handle that? Making a plan is a nice way to do that. And once you end a relationship with people, meaning once you finish a class or once you finish supervising somebody or something, you really want to think about what's going to happen if you run into that person again. So I did not think that I was going to run into the student that I was supervising again and have her actually be in one of my classes. And so we had to have a conversation when I first noticed her that first day. Hey, how do you want to handle this? Do you feel comfortable with me, being your teaching assistant? And she kind of said, well, as long as you feel comfortable leaving that in the past, and it's like, okay, we can switch relationships now.
Compartmentalizing.
Yeah. But sometimes when it's a real serious situation or it's a sensitive relationship, you might want to think about that and have a conversation at the end of that relationship to decide what you might do if you encounter them again, which can easily happen in this small program, this small school.
I think a lot of these things are common sense, and our goal, just in terms of being an orientation, it's more like these are the things we want you to have in your mind as you start the semester. There's no thought that anyone here is going to do something inappropriate or doesn't know what they're doing. But it's just more this prevention idea. Just have this in your mind. If you're thinking about it, you can anticipate some likely scenarios. Know what you need to discuss with the faculty member beforehand. It's just going to help things go much more effectively and smoothly.
Yeah, and I have this insider scoop, but I know you guys know a lot of this already, and I'm eager to hear what you have to add to this list. But just some things that I thought were important to remember is just to be thoughtful and be professional in your relations with others. I think that sometimes when those lines are blurred, it can be hard to sort of do that. And so you want to make sure that you keep that in mind. And consider how others might feel about multiple relationships. Not only how awkward it might be for you, but how about the other person? How do you think they might feel about it? Talk about it, be open, talk to your classmates, talk to your professors about it, and be approachable as a teaching assistant, as a graduate assistant, research assistant, whatever your role is. Let people know that you're there to sort of help them through the process and mean it, because it's your job. Not only, number one, you're getting paid for it, but it's also their experience that's on the line. And it can be really easy to get lost in the amount of work that we have to do and all of the things that we've got going on, and you don't necessarily want to deal with another email or another phone call. But it really is, like Dr. Barnett was saying earlier, think about it from their perspective. It's their grade, it's their project, and they're not really seeing or thinking about how much you might have going on. So try to be understanding to that. And that's something that I've struggled with a lot. Become knowledgeable, and this goes back to confidence. If you don't know it, learn it so that you can feel confident. Work well with others, and we didn't really talk about having a co-TA, but a lot of times you do have a teaching assistant that you work with or other graduate assistants that you're working with. So it's really good to develop good relationships with them and help them out, because sometimes, even though you might not anticipate it, you might need help later on. So it's important to do that. Talk well with others. Save your materials if you're you might not think that you'll, you know, TA the class again, but you might do it 3 times, who knows? Really love it, you know? And then the last issue is something that I don't think people think about that much, because I didn't really think that until it was brought up to me recently, but the whole doctor versus addressing them by their first name. So I know a lot of the professors in the psychology department encourage people to address them by their first name, including the one standing to my right here. But when you're in front of undergraduates, they might not have that same desire, and so you want to make sure that you address them by, you know, Dr. Barnett or whatever.
Well, in their office is different than in the class, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, even when you're talking about him to the students, for instance, you just want to be mindful of how they want to be seen and addressed in front of all the different audiences, so be mindful of that as
Yeah,
well.
I definitely think it's a big issue with undergrads.
Yeah, yeah,
The graduate program, not really. But
right.
Each faculty member is different. You check on that, find out what do they prefer.
Mhm.
Some could care less, some have a strong preference. You know, it's good to find out.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's all. I mean, I think that I'm eager to hear what you guys have to say, what other things that you would want to add. When we had the discussion on Tuesday with the other half of you guys, some other things came up which were really interesting, like being able to advocate for yourself and when you're really busy or when you need things on time, and the other half isn't sort of getting things to you on time. How do you deal with that professionally? How do you express your needs professionally? Things like that.
So for those of you who've done this before, we're wondering what your reactions are to the things we've shared and some of your experiences, and those of you who maybe are doing it for the first time, you know, any concerns or anxieties or thoughts you might be having.
Is anybody doing it for the first time this semester?
So, not to just pick on the 3 of you, but you did raise your hand, so that's voluntary in my book. So what are your thoughts about being TA? Things you've heard here.
I'm excited. I TA'd, well, when I was an undergrad. I've never done it now. I think it's all relevant. I'm eager, I guess, to see how it could be different from when I TA'd as an undergrad, but I think all this. I think it definitely comes out just like you said, at least in my experience. So.
I mean,
Do you have any concerns? Any concerns or worries about
I
it?
think, at least for me, I feel like I like that you guys address the emotional relationships piece, especially because, like for me, if I'm taking a course with the first years, I know a lot of them, so I feel like it was very relevant.
Or you see them at the clinic, and you know, you see them in multiple different ways.
Right, so you're TAing someone, and then you're going to go, like an hour later, you go to the clinic, and you're going to be in the student workroom, and you're at this computer, and they're seated right next to you at that computer, and it's like, this is a different role now, and that has to get worked out. And that's, again, that compartmentalization. But it can be challenging, but just thinking about it and talking about it, as Rachel said, it's easily dealt with. Now, are you 3 TAing together for the same class, or they're different ones? Because I know I've had situations where I'll have 3 TAs in a class, and the communication among the TAs and between me and the TAs is just really important, as opposed to students getting different feedback from different people.
Oh yeah, I had a yeah.
That can happen.
No, yeah, I in the 601, the diagnostics class that I was teaching this past semester, the fellow TA and I made a statement to the students about particular assignment. So let me give you an idea. Basically, we told them that they only had to write 5 reports when they had to actually write 6. So you can imagine how angry the students were when they found out that they actually had to write 6, and it was just a misunderstanding, and it was basically poor communication between the 2 TAs and the professor. And who knows whose fault that was, but you know, in the future, I think that the professor will probably be having regular meetings with her TAs to make sure that things are on the same page, but it was a real nasty situation.
Yeah, and we learned this from experience, because when I first started TAing, I did it totally differently, and then, you know, based on feedback students provide, it's like, okay, with the TAs, we're meeting each week at this time to talk about what's happening this week and what's went on last week, what our plans are, and what's going on with grading. And we're going to make sure we have really good active communication.
Yeah.
So, Diane?
I would second the communication thing, and not just like for a lab, for example, you know, you do have like a game plan for what you're gonna do in lab, like what exercises you're gonna do, but also to communicate before the class, like, you know, when to assign certain assignments and when to hand back certain assignments.
Mhm.
Just things like that might seem awkward to discuss in front of the class during the lab, that, you know, you kind of save some time and some
And save
awkwardness.
face, yeah, absolutely. And what kind of impression is that giving to the students when you're, oh, when's that due? Oh, what? Should we talk about that? You know, I've been there and it's really awkward and uncomfortable. Awful.
Yeah, and if you've TA'd this class before, it can be very natural to just think, oh, I remember all that stuff from last time. You just show up and you're like, oh, maybe I should have reviewed that. And so just being on top of it is I think, really important.
Have any of you guys encountered multiple relationships that have gotten sort of really awkward in your relations as a teaching assistant at all?
Colleen? Honey?
Well. Yeah. Okay, that's an awkward yeah, I think that when you move longer in the program and you've been here for 3 years, you've developed even further multiple relationships than just seeing the person at the clinic or just having met them or, you know. So I think as far as the whole advice on avoiding it, it's just not possible, especially when you agree to be a TA before you are assigned to students in your section.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just think that's all I have to say. It's weird.
Names, there were no names.
You want to see the video, right?
So, but that's important because, like, okay, it's unavoidable, but could you have not TA'd the class?
Right, but when in this particular situation, like TAing for 925, you agree, and then the names of the 4 people that you're going to supervise don't come out until like right before the semester starts, then you're like, oh.
So were they friends of yours, or? I'm just curious what
Yeah.
the relationship
Or
was.
women.
Yeah,
We can
so
put it out there.
Let's just put it out there.
Let's just get
But
going
like, so
there.
for instance, if you're particularly close with somebody, what could you have done? I'm not saying that you should have done this, but you could have essentially contacted the director of the clinic and, you know, asked to have that person not placed, but then, you know, that starts a cascade effect of, you know, you not being in a different section. But these are things that could potentially be thought of if we have orientation sessions like this, where we're bringing this to all of your attention so that you can think of it in the future. I don't know.
Right. And all these dilemmas and situations fall on a continuum, as you know. So it's not like it's a okay or it's bad. You know, it's all going to be somewhere in the middle. So where's that line of like, yeah, sure, you know each other, you're friends. Does that mean you can't be professional? Does that mean you can't give honest, objective feedback? You know, it's like where along that continuum is the line? And that's where the open discussion has to, and not just an open discussion between the 2 of you, but you and the professor, and then being somewhat self-aware and thoughtful about it, and like, you know, well, what would be some of the challenges, and how would I navigate that? And just sort of discussing it beforehand. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, it just means how you do it, being sensitive in doing it, which I know you did or will do, whichever the situation is.
Yeah, and I think that there are also steps you can take, like, you know, the way you address your emails is different than if I was shooting Jess an email and be like, let's hang. It would be different than like, dear Jessica, here's your report, like, let me know if you have questions.
Right, you're in your professional role,
Yeah.
and so you're communicating in that manner, versus if you're in a different role, you might communicate differently, or personal or social. Right?
I know you guys discussed like sort of steps to take to try to avoid bias with grading, but what about like if part of the grade is participation in class and it's sort of like hard to not notice your friend talking, you know, versus like a stranger talking. It's not weird, but you know.
No, yeah, that's definitely hard. I mean, you could get down to the nitty gritty of concrete, you know, how many times do people actually speak up? I mean, tally them, that would be excruciatingly tedious, but yeah.
But I feel like the person that's your friend is gonna be more comfortable speaking in class, so they are gonna participate more, and then it's like, oh, but they.
You know, another concern is, let's say it is your friend, and you have expectations of that person that you might not have of a student you just met for the first time. And so you might be a harsher grader of your friend because he or she should have participated more. Like, you know, when it was silent, you looked at her, and she sits there, you know, it's like, hey, what's that about? You know, I gave you the look, you're supposed to participate. You know, you might expect more of someone you have a relationship with. And so again, being objective and fair and sharing, these are the requirements. You know, here's how class participation is determined. You know, it's being in class, being on time, quantity and quality of participation. And maybe you, as a TA, should just give narrative feedback to the instructor on each student's participation, and the instructor assigns a grade. And so you're just saying, here's what this person did, here's what this person did. And so it's not really on your shoulders to decide is that an A or an A minus. That might help too.
I have a somewhat unrelated question to, I'll just ask the question. What if you have some concerns about the professor's ethical decisions or behavior? What's your role there and your authority? Because that could also be awkward if you have to talk to, even if you had to talk to another professor in the department, what your relationship with that professor is, and who do you go to? Do you go to anyone? Is that your role to be questioning those kinds of things?
I think it's absolutely your role to be questioning those kinds of things, in my personal opinion. I think that for me, the first step would be having some kind of conversation with them about it, as awkward as that could potentially be. Whatever extent you can have that conversation, if it's not received or if things don't change, for instance, I think then going to the next person down the line would be the most appropriate thing to do, I think. I'm sure you have other.
Yeah, it is very awkward and uncomfortable because there's a power differential and you're dependent on this person. You don't want to be fired as a TA if you're getting money or experience. You know, you want this to work out. But at the same time, if you're uncomfortable with something, you have to be able to discuss it. And I think the way you discuss it is the key. You know, as opposed to being very adversarial or confrontational, it could be in a question of like, I was wondering about this idea of having unannounced pop quizzes when the syllabus didn't include that. Are we allowed to do that? And just try to gather information and see where that goes. But I also agree that if you aren't satisfied with how the discussion goes, then the next level is if it's a per course affiliate faculty, it would be to talk to me, or if it's in the master's program to me or to Dr. Sherman, and if it's in the doctoral program to Dr. Layden. So you go to whoever the program director is.
Or if it's at the clinic, go to Dr. Coro.
Right. Yeah. So depending on the setting, exactly. Mm-hmm. But there is someone who's available, who you not only can go to, but you actually, I agree, must go to, and they would want you to. They would be very concerned if you didn't. If they were to find out that you saw something that was questionable even, and didn't bring it to their attention.
Yeah, I think I'm certainly someone who doesn't really keep quiet about anything that I find to be not right. So I've had those experiences where I've had to go and talk to somebody. And I think that when I've gone to the person above the faculty, for instance, the first question has been, did you talk to that person? So I think that that's always going to be sort of the first step, or they're going to ask you but if you don't feel comfortable approaching that person, that's another story, and so.
Or I've brought it up 3 times and it's continued,
yeah.
And that's why I'm coming to you now. Because as you mentioned earlier, you're an advocate for yourself, but you're also an advocate for your students.
Yeah.
And so if you see a student being treated unfairly or unfair grading practices, or what if you have you sit in on the class also, not just the lab, and you're observing that there are problems in how this person's teaching, or whatever the concern might be. You have this obligation also. And again, I agree, it puts you in an awkward or uncomfortable position, but there is that obligation.
Yeah, I was in a really strange position last year where I was a teaching assistant for someone who was not doing their job essentially in teaching, and so the students were really missing out on their experience and what they should have been getting out of it. And so I had to really find a balance between being respectful and talking with the professor and also giving what the students need to them to the best of my abilities, and that was really difficult, but I consulted with a lot of people, and for those in the doctorate program, I know 918, it's a class, like a professional development class. I think that's a really nice forum to sort of brainstorm how to approach those kinds of situations, and that's sort of what I did and what other people did in that situation.
And you have each other. I mean, that's another benefit of, coming to a meeting like this. It's like, okay, these are other TAs, and these are people I can talk to if I have a question or a concern. I think it's a really important point, and I think it's a good issue to bring up, because as much as we might like to think, oh, that could never happen, it can happen.
Did that answer your question?
Are there any other issues or concerns or questions you have, or reactions to, thoughts about anything we talked about? Do you all feel ready to go? You're ready for the semester? Chris, you all set?
I feel pretty good.
Just wanted to check in with
Infinitely
you.
better now,
Just want to
though,
make
right?
sure.
Yeah. No, honestly, I mean, for me, for my personality, I'm more laid back, and I think this presentation is very in depth, and I appreciate just getting all these things on my radar because they wouldn't naturally be. So it's a lot of good material.
Yeah, we know that you guys have, some of you have already been engaged in being a teaching assistant or graduate assistant, research assistant, whatever, for a while, and so the point is not necessarily to give you things that you haven't heard before, but to, like you said, increase the depth of maybe what's on your radar, have you think about it more, hopefully give you something to even use in this coming semester, but also to gain your perspective on things that we might want to continue for future sessions where people haven't actually had their feet wet yet and becoming in this role.
So anyone who's going to be a graduate assistant, a teaching assistant, a research assistant is required to go through this orientation once. You don't have to do this. If you're going to be TAing next year, it doesn't mean you have to come back to this again. It's just, we just want every student to go through this once, and then we'll be posting the PowerPoint and this presentation on the department site, so students will have access to that as well. But we thank you for being here today, and I hope you have a great semester and a great experience being a TA. Thank you for doing that. Hopefully you'll enjoy it.
Bye.
Hit the road.